over history, okay, or history time. Oh, great! Here comes Mrs. Hamry to interrupt me. I guess I'll continue this. All right, back at you here. I had to take a little break for a meeting with other teachers. So I think we were somewhere about Reconstruction. No, I know we're talking about Lincoln and his legacy. Um, and I was talking about his reelection campaign, and he actually obviously won reelection. But it's just interesting, like during actual time versus now, how history views people as to what he did and what he accomplished. All right, basically saved the Union. Okay, saved the Union, saved who we still are, who we are today. Lee, complicated legacy. A lot of people is considered one of the greatest military generals. But then again, here's a guy who went to war with his fellow Americans. Basically seceded, broke all rules of the Constitution. Um, and so, history sometimes talks about Lee, and he's a great general, great guy. Well, I don't know. There's been some things lately in the last 5 years that have kind of bucked that and said, hey, this guy was a slave owner, sided with Virginia, sided with the South. He's not so great. Well, from a military standpoint, yeah. Um, but as far as what the damage he caused, no. Okay. I think you have to look at both sides of that. And then, kind of decide for yourself what outweighs the other. Well, I mean, here's a guy, like I look at it, I mean, really committed treason. Okay? Really committed treason against the United States. One thing he did do, try to kind of reconcile after the war. He was very adamant in persuading other Southerners. The one thing Lee recognizes, he did have a lot of influence, but persuading his fellow Southerners, okay, we lost the war. It's time to become part of the U.S. again. Okay? We're no longer at war. You need to swear your loyalty oath, so on and so forth. Lee died shortly after the war, I think 3 years, 4 years. He actually became a president of a college in his retirement. So, Frederick Douglass, who we talked about last chapter, also abolitionist. Remember, was a former slave. Remember, he was quoted in the video we watched as well too. Um, so he even gave a more powerful voice for your new freedmen. And so Frederick Douglass was definitely, very important as far as still speaking out against no longer anti-slavery, but equal rights for African Americans after the war. Post-war economy. You have big differences between the North and the South. So at the bottom here, okay, big difference between North and South. For the South, um, the economy wiped out, devastated, in shambles. You guys have seen some of the pictures. Buildings destroyed, roads destroyed. Remember we talked about Sherman ripping up the railroad tracks, all these types of things. The South economy, went way down. I think a barrel. One thing I heard years ago, a barrel of flour cost like $500. Just because inflation was so high. Also during the war, the Confederates had printed their own money. Well, there's nothing to back that money. So at the end of that war, the Confederate money was worthless. And there's still places out there today where you can buy this old Confederate money, and it's still worthless to this day. I mean, it's not worth any currency, but it's not really, I mean, some people like it as a collector's item, but it's not something like, oh, this is worth hundreds of dollars. So their economy basically crashed. Know that the Southern economy crashed. Now, the North, what I want you to write for that, the North economy was booming. Okay. Well, why? Well, during the war, you got to remember, they were still building the Capitol building. They were still building railroads. They were still building telegraphs. You had companies producing firearms, cannons, clothing. A lot of times war is big business. So after the war, the North was still producing at a high level. And now, who are they making goods for? The South. And who had all the factories? You guys remember that was the chapter we talked about before the war. The North had all the factories. So those factories just kept going. And if not even more so than during the war. Oh, man. I love allergy season. Anyways, so those are your biggest differences. They were a total opposite after the war. And once again, that goes to back, like I said at the beginning, reconstruct the economy. We have to get the South moving again. Remember, what was the Southern economy based on? Agriculture, right? Still, even after the war, the South was based on agriculture. You can't just build factories overnight. So the key thing was to get these farmers back in the fields producing and producing and producing. Okay. Now, turn the page. And so we're up here at the top. Everybody see that? It says tenant farmers and sharecropping. So what we're going to do there, talk about those. Then we'll go into section 3. And then section 4 is real short. Or no, wait, section 4. Section 3, you only have 3s. Mr. Avery's having trouble counting to 3. Anyways, and we'll talk about the end of Reconstruction as well. So, tenant farmers. A tenant farmer is somebody that rents land from a landowner. Okay, so know that a tenant farmer is somebody who rents land from a landowner and pays them money to rent that land. So they pay them an agreed upon price, okay, an agreed upon price to rent this land. So let's say they're doing, 160 acres. They say, all right, I'm gonna rent this for $100. Now, whether that land produces at all or a little bit or does really great, has a great harvest, they still just pay them $100. Okay. So what we're talking about is in the South, and I'm explaining this. Sharecropping is similar. Sharecropping is similar. Sharecropping is that you, instead of paying money for rent, you pay the landowner usually a third of the crops produced. That doesn't mean they give them a third of the crops necessarily, but whatever they sell, if they sell all the crops, and let's say the crops don't make $1,000, then they pay them 1/3 of $1,000, okay, or 1/3 of $2,000, or whatever it may be. So the reason we bring those up is this is what was happening in the South. Like I said earlier, you had all these freedmen now. Where could they go? Where did they have houses? They didn't. Many of them, what they turned around and did is they just lived right there on the plantation. Okay, they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have money to go anywhere. They didn't have education. They didn't have skills. They didn't have horses. They didn't have plows. They didn't have tools. They didn't have barns. They didn't have livestock. Which is part of was Lincoln's plan with a few freedmen's bureau to get them on their feet. But it only went so far. So what happened is many of these former farm owners and plantation owners, they offered to their former slaves jobs as farmers on their land. So, okay, you're no longer slaves. You can live here. In exchange for you living here, you pay me XYZ rent. Or you can live here and you get to farm this 160, 320 acres, and you pay me a percentage of those crops. Now, it sounds like a good arrangement at first, like, hey, we know you have nowhere to go. We're going to let you stay here and you just pay us this rent and this rent. Well, the problem is that those former slaves that were there never could make enough money through this system to either buy more land, buy their own equipment, buy their own livestock, and move off the place. So it sounds good at first, like, oh, all these plantation owners, oh, just live here. You know where this is anyways. You know how to work the land. Well, and it sounds good, like on paper, but they could never make enough money to get ahead. So many of these former slaves really kind of became slaves again. They, they made just enough money to live, but then they had to stay there. Okay, so that was the system throughout the South also, which went on for a while. Um, Now, they weren't held against their will, but many of them didn't know where to go, didn't have an option where to go. Remember that. The next part, new roles of women. So during the war, remember a lot of men killed, right? So wives became widows. Uh, you had the economy in the South upturned. You had women in the North having to take on jobs in factories. Not like in World War One or World War Two, but definitely had to step into new roles. So a couple of new roles is one famous person, Clara Barton, who eventually founded the Red Cross. She was a nurse during this time. So one was hospital care, the nursing corps. They were able to step in that. More and more women. I mean, they had already been teachers, but took up roles in like higher education, especially in the North. Like I said, factory workers, many had to step in for husbands. Many women now became, who if they lost a husband in the war, they became, the head of the household, primary breadwinner. Well, you got to find a job, okay? And so jobs started to open up for women as well, okay? Not like it is today, but more and more responsibility was taken. So, all right, so let's do our section 3. So yes, we're going to the next one that says political changes. And hang on a second. Put you on pause. I'm coming. All right, back at it. Here we go. Chapter 10, section 3. So we are right there where it says political changes. Everybody see that? All right. So, what we want to talk about during Reconstruction is some key political changes. One is you had your first African Americans elected to local, state, and federal offices in the South. Okay. Local, federal, and state offices in the South. So that was a big change. You also had many of these former Confederate leaders, who were not eligible under Reconstruction to run for office again. Um, so they were kind of removed. Well, they were removed from power per se. Now they came back in, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Um, so that was a big political change. Also, you had more people of the Republican Party, um, in the South now, not just the North, but then also the Democrat Party started to move north and grow north a little bit too. So politics always changes. You guys are kind of too young to really see it. When I was like your age, California was a big Republican area. That's actually Ronald Reagan was elected, out of California. Like today, that's like a foreign concept. But politics always change. Okay, it's gonna be different here and there. Well, think about Reconstruction. They were forced to change, right? They had to change. Okay? They had to change based on law, based on their past, based on your military enforcement in the South. Okay? So another thing in the South, violence in the South. You had a lot of violence, uh, not from everybody, but you had violence against former slaves. Many people in the South did not want blacks to have equal treatment. And many of them still had those prejudice. That they were slaves. They were not the same as white people. Okay, um, so you had a lot of people in the South too resented what the federal government was telling them what to do. That you had these military districts telling them you have to do this, you have to do this, and they didn't like that, which is part of the reason the Civil War started in the first place. Um, so, anyways, you had your first, it could be local violence, unorganized violence, but you did have your first groups that started to be formed. Were very intent on terrorizing, African Americans. And so an organization that came about was the Ku Klux Klan, with the short form of KKK. Now, unfortunately, that's an organization that's still around today. It's listed as a hate organization. Membership is not that high. Obviously, very